in the development of Christianity, you have certain themes and certain ideas that are developed. One of them is, and this is a very clear idea, that with the coming of Jesus, Judaism stops being valid, and the Torah is no longer valid. From now on, from the time of Jesus, only Christianity is the valid faith. And that is a clear statement of Christianity. The other thing is that Christianity had very much concern about certain symbols. One of them being that the destruction of the temple was symbolic of the end of Judaism as a valid religion. Not only does Judaism stop being the valid way of becoming at one with God, since Jesus is the fulfillment of what Judaism foretold and promised, not only is Judaism no longer valid, but symbolically, God permitted the temple to be destroyed in order to show that Judaism is at an end. Christianity, and we can see it when we read in the early writings, and not just the early writings, but throughout Christian history until modern times, there is a very passionate commitment to faith in Christ as the only faith. And those who are not Christians are outside the realm of those who are to be saved. Now, I know that in the course of time, certain variations were made. I mean, there was a time when they said, well, if someone were exposed to the gospel and they didn't become Christian, then they are condemned. But then someone said, well, what if some people never knew about the gospel, never heard the story, didn't know anything, and they're good and honest and kind people? Well, an exception was made in that case. And some Christian theologians have also redefined what Paul was saying, because Paul said certain things which seemed to imply his faith in Judaism as a Jew. And he implies that that never left him. So he is saying, in effect, because I'm a Jew and I live according to Judaism. As he says, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Those are the words he uses. But he is preaching to the Gentiles, and they don't have to become Jews to become Christians. They can become Christians through faith in Christ. So it's clear that there is some kind of statement, and there's nothing invalid about that. I mean, Paul could have said, as we understand these words, he could have said, look, I'm preaching faith in Christ to the whole world. Jews have Judaism. And one other point that Paul says is interesting. God made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, which means God has a covenant with the Jewish people. And then he says, if God made a covenant, it stands forever. God doesn't break his promises. God doesn't break his contracts. Well, there you have a very interesting statement, which some Christian theologians now have said, well, this means that the Jewish covenant between God and the Jews, which starts with Abraham, is eternal and permanent to this day and valid to this day. The covenant with the non-Jewish world has to be through Christ. So they've actually made this new definition of what Paul was saying. But in general, we find that Christianity has very strong views and doesn't tolerate much opposition, as we'll see as it develops. Yes?
How is the view that the destruction of the temple was symbolic of the end of continuing Judaism square with the view of some fundamentalists that the temple has to be rebuilt as a condition to the coming of Christ?
That's an interesting story. That's an interesting variation. It doesn't contradict anything. It's an interesting variation. It derives from traditional Christianity, but it has been focused in modern times, and that is the idea of when is Jesus going to return? When Jesus came, he was the Messiah, the Redeemer. He was killed, And then what? Well, then he went up to live alongside God his Father, and Jesus becomes then another aspect of the divinity. So Jesus is God. What about the second coming? Since Jesus the Redeemer came, and the world is not redeemed, evidently, obviously, not only is it a war of conflict, a world of conflict, but in the course of time, Christians have been killing Christians also. So something must happen to bring about the total redemption, which means Jesus has to return again. Well, why hasn't he come? Look, we came to the year 1000. Nothing happened. Now we're at the year 2000. Still nothing happened to change, except that evidently the computers were all in conformity. Now, what is delaying the return? What is delaying the second coming? Then a theology developed that there have to be certain preparations, and one of them has to be the restoration of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, the return of the Jews to the state of Israel, the return, as some say, of all the Jews to the state of Israel, the rebuilding of the temple, and then Jesus will come. That is the theology of a certain group of Christians. Many of them are fundamentalists, and some are evangelical, but this is a view of Christians. And notice how the role of the Jews in Christianity is a constant. Christianity relies on Judaism, either as the foundation of its faith or as a necessary component of Christian life. St. Augustine said that the Jewish people are an important element of world history, and we as Christians have to be protective of the Jewish people. We have to protect them. We have to condemn them because they rejected Christ. So that goes without saying. But we are still obligated to protect the Jewish people because they are an important part of the witness to history. These are the words he uses. The Jews are the people who witnessed history, and they are an important part of our world. The fact that the Jews are ruled by the church is symbolic of the fact that the church is the expression of God's will, and the Jews must be punished for rejecting Christ. But this world has to be that way. There were Christians who also said, we don't need the Jews. Those theologies were rejected by the church as heretical.